Okay, let's get started. Hi again, this is STACIE O'BEIRNE from Front Row Insurance Brokers, and I have my colleague Catherine Hoffman that's going to also participate in the webinar. And we're going to just go through and talk about basic production insurance and touch a little bit on what's happening in the insurance marketplace due to COVID. So basically, these are the different types of policies that would be necessary, not necessarily all of them, but would be appropriate to get quotes on for any type of film production. So there's the production package, which is the majority of where your coverage would be: general liability, auto liability, workers' compensation, umbrella liability, guild, union, travel accident, and errors and omissions. So we're going to start with the main policy that you would have most of your claims with is what we consider your property and business interruption coverages. So these are all under one policy. You've got cast, negative, faulty stock, prop sets, wardrobe, miscellaneous equipment, third-party property damage, extra expense, office contents, and then money and currency. So with cast coverage, this would cover delays in your production due to the injury or death or illness of a covered person. So these people would need to be declared to the policy, and usually either a statement of health or a medical exam has to be done. This coverage usually also extends to include kidnap and family bereavement. So if you have a covered cast member, say that their father died or a child, then the cast coverage would apply to those delays in coverage also. To go along with cast coverage, you could end up having an essential element, which usually it's a contractual requirement from a distributor that names a talent that must be in the completed film for them to take delivery for distribution. So to get this coverage, there has to be an actual contract that requires this, and there is an additional premium and extensive medical exams that go along with it. So it's not just a statement of health or, where they take a blood pressure. They actually have to have blood work done, EKGs, stress tests, and a lot of different exam requirements. The other thing goes along that happens sometimes, and to be honest with you, this is happening a lot now due to COVID. We're starting to get films back into production. Stop dates. The insurance companies require that talents have no more than a 2 weeks gap between the production that we're insuring and them going on to another production. So the insurance companies will not insure if there is a stop date issue.
Hi, everybody. This is Catherine Hoffman, and I just wanted to note that we are taking questions and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. So I think there's a spot for you to type in your questions, and then we will read them at the end and answer them for you. So I am going to talk to you about negative and faulty. So negative film is direct physical loss, damage, or destruction of raw film or tape stock, exposed film, or videotape. And as we all know, those are very archaic terms, but those are the ones that are on the policy. Up-to-date terms would be hard drives and memory cards. So a negative loss would be like a hard drive or a memory card that was stolen or destroyed by fire. Luckily now we have clouds where we can store our content, and most productions are using that type of technology. And so with those backups, we avoid claims. But if you had not backed up a certain, something that you were doing in post-production or something, and it was destroyed, there would be coverage for that exposure that wasn't saved. And then way back when we would see claims, we're just kind of telling about claims that we've seen in our past, but film reels would be lost by UPS or FedEx, and they would say that they were in some storage facility and never be found. So then they would have to do reshoots. So times have definitely changed. So going on to faulty stock. So this is for loss, damage, or destruction of negative film caused by or resulting from fogging or the use of faulty materials, including a camera, faulty sound equipment, faulty developing, again, old school terms. So you could have a faulty hard drive or memory card and camera. The policies do ask that you test equipment prior to use, but that doesn't always catch problems at that time. So sometimes things happen after that, or something happens during the course of the day and you would end up with a faulty stock claim because you had to reshoot.
So the next few coverages are really basic property coverage that you would have what we call behind the scenes. So you have your prop sets wardrobe. Really, it is exactly what it says. It's going to be damage to or destruction of your prop sets and wardrobe. There could be certain exclusions, but like stuff stored out in the open that shouldn't be, things like that. But it also can be extended to include animals if you need it. Again, it's just basic property damage to your prop sets and wardrobe. The next one, same thing, is equipment. It covers all of your destruction of camera, sound, lighting equipment, generators, grip, and also loss of use. Most vendors require that you provide loss of use, so it's covering their loss of rental income while it's being repaired or replaced. And actually, most auto vehicle physical damage is included with the miscellaneous equipment with most insurance companies.
So going on to third-party property damage. So legal liability for damage to or destruction of property belonging to others, including loss of use of the property while the property is in your care, custody, and control. So this would be your locations. And we all know that things happen on location. And this is a really important coverage and one that we see a lot of claims filed against. So third-party property damage would cover scratched floors, broken tables, vehicles parking on the lawn. We see that a lot. Note that each of these coverages, each of these losses would have separate deductibles. So, if you did scratch the floors, you'd have a $2,500 deductible, or whatever the policy states the deductible is. And then if you had ruined the lawn, you would have a $2,500 deductible. So each loss has a separate deductible. And we also suggest that if you're using a really high valued location, let's say you're filming in a house that's worth $2 or $3 million for 30 days, you may want to let us know that you would like to increase the third-party property damage limit. I don't know how high the carriers will go now, usually 2, maybe 3 million. The general average limit that they provide is $1 million. But if you're using one location for a long period of time and it's high valued, you might want to increase that limit. And also, if you bought an umbrella policy, most umbrella policies would increase the third-party property damage limit as well. Moving on to extra expense. So extra expense covers you for extra expenses incurred due to delays in production. So the delay could be damage to equipment. So your camera broke or died on you and you have to wait for a new camera to show up. Or your location was damaged. It could be by a storm, a fire, something like that. So you either have to scramble and try to find a new location, or you have to wait for that location to be fixed so that you can use it. So those would create extra expenses that you would incur, and that's what this coverage would provide. Now, under the extra expense, there's also civil authority. So if the police, the mayor, the governor, Homeland Security say you cannot enter this area, something happened here, you can't go to your location, and you have a delay in filming, the civil authority would apply to that type of exposure. Currently, we are seeing COVID-19 claims under this coverage, where stay-at-home orders were put in place and cities were pulling permits. So there are claims out there currently dealing with the COVID-19 delay. Unfortunately, now all of the policies that are being written have a COVID exclusion on them, so they would not cover a COVID claim. Also note that some policies limit the civil authority coverage to 3 days, and others do not have a restriction like this. So it's important to know what time period you have for coverage on the civil authority. And then there's also imminent peril coverage under the extra expense. If you have to cause damage to stop a bigger claim from happening, for example, throwing water on props and wardrobe to stop a fire from spreading, that would be imminent peril. We have also seen a few imminent peril claims come through for COVID-19 where the imminent peril was a crew member was tested positive for COVID-19, so they had to quarantine and test other crew or cast members, and that fell under the imminent peril. And like I said before, as of now, we have no COVID coverage on the policies, so they're excluding that. But we did see quote or claims for imminent peril come in for the COVID. So, Stacie?
Nice type of this one, Catherine.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Gotcha. My computer froze, so we have a time limit on our computer, so I couldn't see the screen. So office contents is also provides coverage on office property and computers, including laptops and similar property against risks of physical loss, damage, or destruction. Office contents, like I said, does have coverage for computers. Some of them are sublimits for computers. And if you have crew members that you want to cover their personal computers under the policy, you do need to have deal memos in place that specifically state that you are renting their computer from them and or providing primary coverage for that computer so that there's no question if a claim comes through and that person's laptop is broken or stolen. And note that when things are stolen, you definitely need to file a police report. You need to show like proof of some type of break-in, that kind of thing. We can't just file a claim and say the computer disappeared. So mysterious disappearance is not something that would normally be covered. Money and currency. This provides coverage for actual physical loss of funds during production. So if you have a petty cash box and it's against robbery or theft, and again, theft, you need to file a police report and make sure that you have information on how it was stolen or where or when, or have some sort of physical evidence that somebody broke in.
So now we're coming to the hot topic of 2020. As Catherine mentioned in a couple of the other slides, the insurance marketplace is a completely different world right now than it was in the beginning of March. There's only a few insurance companies that do film production. I mean, there's maybe 4 or 5, and all of them are handling it differently as to what they're offering and how they're dealing with the COVID. So most of the insurance companies are actually just putting a full exclusion for any COVID-related claims and or communicable disease coverages. So pretty much at this point, there is no coverage under the standard film production policies for COVID. There's a few insurance companies that are taking a different tactic and saying, well, we'll provide COVID. We're not going to exclude COVID coverage, but we're not going to offer you any of the coverage that it would apply to, like Catherine mentioned with civil authority and imminent peril and cast coverage. Those were the areas where all of the claims that we saw, and we saw a lot, civil authority being the largest because the whole world shut down. So with every country and every state and every city pulling permits or making mandatory quarantines, there's no way you could film. So that most of it fell within the civil authority. The imminent peril ones that we saw, like Catherine mentioned, were the claims where a crew member or a cast member was tested positive because they weren't feeling well. Well, now you've got to shut the production down. You can't put the rest of your cast and crew in peril. And then cast coverage claims. I had a production that the lead person got ill and ended up having to quarantine for 2 weeks. And as they were quarantining, the city pulled the permit. So they had a double claim. They had a cast coverage claim and then a civil authority claim on top of that. So at this point, if you've got productions going, what we're doing is getting the data that we need, like we would normally do, and we're putting it out into the marketplace and then seeing what's available. There are instances right now where we can get some CAS, civil authority, and imminent peril coverage, but it's very sublimited, meaning they're not going to provide your full budget limits. And then we're looking into alternate options, especially for CAS coverage, whether it be like more of a non-appearance or life and even a key man life type coverages. So we'll get into some other issues with that in a few minutes. So general liability and auto liability are just exactly what they're saying. It's legal liability for property, bodily injury or property damage to third parties. So, from a general liability standpoint would be filming in Times Square, and you've got, your booms up and everything, and somebody's walking by, a pedestrian's walking by, and they either trip and fall over cable cords or somebody drops something on top of them. That's an injury to a third party. It has nothing to do with your crew or anybody. It would be somebody not associated with production. And the same thing with non-owned auto liability. You've got, PAs running around driving for production and they get in a car accident and it was their fault. It would cover the bodily injury or property damage to the other party's vehicles. And this does not apply to aircraft or watercraft. Those are done separately. And workers' compensation. This is, Catherine, you want to take this one?
Yep. So workers' compensation, we always quote workers' comp, even if productions say they don't need it or they're using a payroll service. It provides coverage for your cast and crew per state laws and requirements. And even if you have a payroll service, you could potentially have someone that worked for you for the day that you paid, or an intern or a volunteer, and then the payroll service would not pick up those individuals. So we always quote even a minimum premium workers' compensation policy if you are using a payroll service. If you're not using a payroll service, we do ask you for your payroll information, and you should always include independent contractors in this number for your payroll, because independent contractors, unless they have their own insurance and they provide you proof of that insurance, they are going to fall under your workers' compensation policy. So the example of if you tell someone when to show up and what their job duties are, they are not an independent contractor in regards to workers' compensation. An example of an independent contractor would be your accountant sitting in his office doing his job with no input from you. That would be someone that you could definitely consider as a true independent contractor. So what's happening is on all production insurance that we write workers' comp, and this has happened for years, but sometimes the carriers are really diligent and they do final audits all the time. Sometimes they don't. And we've had carriers start picking up and doing final audits on the workers' compensation, and they're going 2 years back. So you get an email or from the carrier or from us with a final audit worksheet that we need you to complete, and you complete it and you put your independent contractors on there that you didn't include their payroll, and all of a sudden you have an additional premium due and it's 1 or 2 years past the production, which is a bummer. So we definitely suggest that you include your independent contractor payroll up front. If they have their own coverage, make sure you get the copies of the coverage or a certificate of insurance proving they have coverage and keep them on file, so that when you do get your final audit worksheet that you can provide that information and avoid having an additional premium due.
So we touched a little bit on this earlier with Catherine. The umbrella liability, all it really is it's adding additional limits to your general liability, auto, employer's liability under the workers' comp, and then the third-party property damage, which is damage to your locations. Some locations will not accept just a standard $1 million limit, which is general under the standard general liability and auto liability policies. I deal with this all the time. Several locations may require 5, and even some of your networks that you may be doing a production with may require that you have 5 million of coverage or 10 million of coverage. So this is just where it's just a separate policy that increases the limits under all of these different policy sections.
Okay, so now on to Guild Union Travel Accident. So provides travel accident coverages, accidental death or dismemberment as required by the Guild or union contracts to which the producer is a signatory. Coverage is blanket and the limits of liability meet all of their requirements. So the coverage also may extend to non-union employees, usually with a benefit of $50,000 each person. So it's not a bad coverage to have in place to provide the extra benefits. The only thing is that you need to know what the requirements are from the Guild and the union that you're signing with so that you can let us know, and then we can place the coverage that you're required to have.
Yeah, some of the guilds and unions I know, like SAG, will do waivers that you don't need this coverage, but we don't know that, so you would need to let us know on your productions if it's required or not. We know that if it's some type of big production, it's probably going to be required if you've got SAG, IATSE, those type of unions involved. But we don't know that from our end. You have to let us know. So now here comes the fun stuff that where we would have to get heavily involved, and as will you, with special risks. Whether most of the insurance policies, the basic insurance policies, will not cover any type of weather-related claims, and there's specialty insurance for that. And it's not cheap. It's very expensive, and it's day rated, meaning you would have to have specific dates of the shoot, the hours of the shoot, and they go and they do data. They pick up data for those dates, like rain amounts, or if it's the winter snow amounts for those dates, the historical data. That's how they rate that type of policy. Aircraft, that's always a high risk and special risk coverage. There's only very few insurance companies that will do aircraft, especially for filming. Aircraft has kind of gone by the wayside a little bit more now that drones are more popular, but that is also considered an aircraft by the FAA now. So it is special coverage, and drone activities are not covered under basic production policies. Watercraft can be covered under the basic policies, but we need more information to get it approved. Otherwise, it has to be done as a special risk also. It's usually not that expensive. Watercraft insurance is fairly cheap, but it is a special market if it's not covered under your basic insurance. Railroads can be very complicated, and being in New York, I can tell you that MTA in New York is probably the most difficult. They require very special coverage and wording and documents, and it does take time for that. So railroads is not something. It could depend on the railroad. If it's in Kentucky, it might be easier, but it is something that takes a little bit of time to get done. A lot of times the documentation needs to be notarized that the MTA wants. So again, it just depends on where you're filming on the railroad as to what the requirements are. But New York MTA, I can tell you, is very difficult. Stunts and pyrotechnics require approval. Even if you think it's a basic stunt, we still have to run it by the insurance company. Any type of pyrotechnics are usually excluded until approved. So if it's a big explosion, that's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take risk assessments. If it's something just like a flash box, that might be easy to get approved pretty quickly. Foreign shoots, most of our basic policies do not cover foreign activity for the liability. Most of the property and production package coverages are worldwide for your equipment and your cameras and that type of stuff, but the liability is not. It is exclusive to U.S. and Canada, so we have to put in place a foreign policy, and it usually is just covering all your foreign liability, general liability, non-owned auto, workers' comp, and then it usually adds, the foreign package adds kidnap and confiscation if you're not in a high-risk area. Mexico, we cannot get kidnap coverage on a package. We have to buy that separately. So now on to E&O coverage. Errors and omissions is going to be required for distribution. You don't necessarily need it when you're filming, but you're not going to get distributed if you don't have it. And what this basically is covering is mostly defense costs for claims or for suits that are brought against you. But it's usually for unauthorized use of titles, format, ideas, characters, unfair competition, defamation, libel, slander, copyright infringement. So it's just all of those different types of things that come from a visual aspect of your production. So the process, we will get phone calls a lot asking us to quote the E&O. And depending on the production, we may be able to give you an idea of what the costs are going to be, but we cannot formally quote without an application from you, and that application must be completed fully and signed. And a lot of the insurance companies will want to make sure that you do have an attorney. Some will waive it if it's kind of a innocuous type of production. But they will want the application process is also regards to clearances, making sure that you've done all of the clearances with regards to people in the production, the written, the script itself, that you've got licensing for all your locations and people in the production and everything. If it's a fictional, that they're going to want to make sure you've got a copyright report. Documentaries don't necessarily need that. Most insurance companies are also going to require a title report and opinion letter. So that's some of the insurance companies right now will include title coverage without this, but a lot of distributors will require that you have it in your deliverables anyway. So then it comes to fair use, which is usually just documentaries, and we'll go through that process. So fair use is a doctrine of the law in the United States that permits limited use of copyrighted material without having to first acquire permission from the owner. Fair use is one of the limitations to copyright intended to balance the interests of copyright holders with the public interest in the wider distribution and the use of creative works by all, allowing as a defense to copyright infringement claims certain limited uses that would otherwise be considered infringement. And usually this is more for like newsworthy or educational. So the purpose and the character of the use is including whether it is commercial nature or is nonprofit educational purposes. If it's for a commercial nature, it could not be considered fair use. And then they'll look at the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount of the substantiability of the portion used in the relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. So if you're just showing one clip, it's easier to consider fair use than majority of the production being copyrighted work. 4 factors or more than it's just a checklist. It's more than a checklist. They have to be analyzed on an individual level. This is where the lawyers need to get involved because you need to to get it insured. There must be a clip log of all of the different items being considered fair use, and a legal opinion letter from an attorney is required as to why it's fair use. Most insurance companies want to know who that law firm is because they will want to make sure it is a law firm that is in this realm and not just somebody who doesn't know it. Catherine?
Yep. So on to completion bonds. So, as production starts to gear up, we're getting inquiries about completion bonds, and it's very complicated right now with the COVID-19 issues. Carriers are excluding COVID-19 from the policies, including cast coverage, and the bond companies do not want to bond a film that does not have full insurance coverage. So we do have access to some carriers that are giving us sublimits for cast insurance, civil authority, and imminent peril that does include COVID, but it's on a limited basis. So the bond companies are not really agreeing with the limits that we're providing yet. So we'll just have to wait and see how that goes. So the completion bond is a written contract that guarantees a motion picture will be finished and delivered on schedule and within budget. Most independently financed films require a completion guarantee. There are only a few companies that will write film completion bonds. The bond companies require as much insurance in place as possible, which goes with what I was just saying, to protect the budget for delays in production. So if you are going to be doing a bonded film, I say start sooner than later so that your broker has plenty of time to get as much coverage in place as possible to appease the bond company.
So anybody, we're going to get to questions and answers. If you have any questions, you can type them into the section at the bottom of your screen, and we can do some questions and answers now.
So question from Don. Do the policies specify hard drives, memory cards, etc. for negative stock damage coverage?
Yes,
Yes.
the policies do provide additional wording that includes coverage for all of those types of media.
Yeah, the
Okay.
screen, our slides aren't big enough to put every little thing in there, but we gave the basics because that's kind of what the policies state. But most of them, it's just known, and some of them actually have endorsements extending the wording out now to pick up what the new terminologies are.
Okay, question from Mark. I believe production insurance is necessary for any project. However, premiums are very expensive for independent ultra-low budget productions. Are you aware of any ways that indie producers can obtain coverage for a more affordable premium?
Catherine, you want me to take that?
Sure.
Yeah, you know what? It's not getting any better with COVID. We do understand, and there's different options. I mean, we went through what is considered the standard of what most productions would buy. We do have options in certain programs we can go to where we can just pick and choose what coverage you want. If it's ultra low budget, a lot of times you're only filming for maybe a week, and you just need a short-term policy to be able to secure locations and rent your equipment, and we can do that too. So it's just like we call short-term insurance, and it's usually cheaper, although the coverage is not as broad as buying it from the standard marketplace, but it can be done, and it's usually a little more cost-effective for you because you're not paying for a full annual policy.
Okay, Erica has a couple of questions here. She asked about the, I think it's the renting vehicles policy. Would that eliminate the need to insure a car with the rental company? And she also asks if acts of God would fall under extra expense.
In regards to renting vehicles, you would not need to purchase additional coverage. If you had a production package that included the hired auto physical damage, it would cover any damage to the vehicle under that policy. And if you have the non-owned auto liability, you would have coverage under that policy for the liability for any accidents. Do you want to do the acts of God?
Oh, well, yeah, sorry. The acts of God, I mean, yes. I mean, it depends on what it is. I can't say that every act of God is covered. Hurricane right now is not covered. So, you're going to get a hurricane exclusion on any production package policy from June 1 to December 1. And you either have to go buy special coverage for that. If under imminent peril, if you're out filming and a freak thunderstorm comes in and you've got lightning, hitting around, and you've got to get your crew and your equipment out of the way. So that act of God would be covered under the imminent peril if you have it. So it really is dependent upon what it is. But yeah, in basic weather insurance, just because it's raining, is not covered either. So really, it just depends. Earthquakes, most policies don't exclude earthquake. We had tons of earthquake claims when the Northridge quake happened in '94, across from sets to negative film, everything was covered. So that was an act of God. So again, it just depends on the situation.
So I'll just mention that people can download the slides of the webinar under the handouts dropdown on the GoToWebinar control panel if you'd like. Tiffany has a question. Why is insurance coverage not offered for cast in documentaries?
Want me to take that, Catherine?
Sure.
Sure. It can be offered. I mean, we've done it in the past. It is not normal on a documentary that you need cast insurance because you're not doing a 30, 45 day, 60-day shoot with Tom Cruise that would shut production down. Most documentaries are interviews, and you can go. You're not the deductible probably wouldn't even meet a claim. If somebody got sick, you could go back 20 days later and pick up that interview shoot. So that's why it's not typically provided. It's not to say that it's not done because we do it. It's just something that you would have to add on to, and it usually would be a specific documentary film, not like a big annual where you go out and you're doing a bunch of different little shoots all the time. But it can be done, just not normal.
Yeah, and most often, if we do it, it's for like a host that's hosting a series of documentaries or something like that, and then we do get the coverage, and you will have cast coverage on that person.
Yeah, or a documentary on a specific living person. So my just one that came to mind. Say you're doing a documentary on Elton John and you're following him around for 6 months, then you might want to think about it too. Those are the type of situations where we can add it. It's gonna be more like a feature film rate than a regular standard documentary rating.
Okay. Jordan asks, could you explain the difference between additional insurance and loss payee? I think he may mean additional insured and loss payee. What's the difference?
So an additional insured is somebody under the liability policy. So when you're naming someone as additional insured, you're including them under your liability policy as respects your negligence. And a loss payee is for property. So if you're renting equipment from somebody or a location and there's a check written, they're going to be the loss payee along with you on that check.
So yeah, in general, additional insured is for liability, loss payee is for property.
Okay, thanks. So a question from Lauren. Oh, actually, that's a little bit too broad. Question from Don. You said that the FAA considers drones to be aircraft. Does that mean that we would still need specific aircraft coverage, or is separate drone coverage available?
Yeah, separate drone coverage is available. It's not as expensive as owning an aircraft by any stretch, but there is specialty coverage that you can get, either just liability for your use or even the physical damage to the drone itself. And it's not that expensive, to be honest with you, just depending on how many you have and the values and how often you use it. It can be done for owned drones. And if you are just renting a drone, you should have some of non-owned drone coverage, and then the owner operator should have their own coverage and name you as an additional insured if you're actually contracting it out.
Mm-hmm. Diane asks, is there a rule of thumb for a percentage of the budget to put in for insurance when developing a budget?
Oh, this is a tough one now, because if you would have asked me in February, I would have told you a percentage for a feature film. Right now, it's hard. And to be honest with you, I would have to say right now, I would put in 2% just to be safe for a feature film. Because we're seeing it, everything's all over the place with rating, and we've found ourselves even shocked a little bit as we're starting to now gear up and get feature films in for quoting. So we've been seeing a lot of the budgets coming in under budgeting their insurance line because they're using what was being done 6 months ago.
And also, if you're interested in getting COVID coverage for cast insurance, we're seeing quotes come in at like 10% of the limit. So for $1 million limit, it would be $100,000 premium. So obviously it would depend on the size of the budget and other determining factors. But if you needed the COVID cast coverage, then that's the type of premium you would be looking at.
Yeah, for example, if you've got a bonded film and you really have to have that coverage, it's really expensive.
Okay. So Nancy just wants me to let everyone know that we do give a discount for WIFT members through WIFT-US. That can all be found on the website frontrowinsurance.com. If you click over on the US flag, you'll find the WIFT-US webpage there, and all the information is laid out there. John O'Hara has a question. Can independent shorts be covered under DICE? If so, do we have to lay out an annual plan of shorts, or can we get annual coverage to cover shorts during 1 year?
I can answer that. Doing one of those right now. So there is really only one, maybe two carriers that would entertain this. And if they're like in the $200,000 range or less, we can get them to write an annual policy. We do need an idea of how many you think you'll do during the year, and we can actually declare them as we go along. So if we surpass the minimum policy premiums, then we would just charge additional premium based on the budgets of how many you declare. But it is a good thing if all of them will be complete through post during that 1-year term.
Okay. Yeah, a couple more questions here. As a college professor, how many underwriters have policies for college school general liability to cover student productions? I know some colleges have general liability coverage for their film programs.
Well, I mean, I can answer that because I've worked on a couple in the New York area for the film schools. I don't know what the current insurance marketplace is going to be like. I know that there were a few insurance companies that would do it, 3, 4, and 5 years ago, because I worked on those programs before. But I can't answer what it's going to be like now at all. That may kind of go away, but there are markets that will look at it. I think it's going to depend on how much involvement the risk management departments at those schools are involved, and that's how I was able to get the college film schools covered before, because there was a lot of rules and manuals in place as to regulations and being what they were doing.
Okay. Abigail asks, do you think they will expand COVID coverage once people begin to develop set procedures that measure body temperature or other tests to ensure the bubble on set is secure?
I mean, I would say no. I would say until there's a vaccine, they're probably not going to revisit the COVID coverage. We're hoping the U.S. government will create a COVID coverage like they have the terrorism coverage. I'm sure you're all familiar with whether or not you want TRIA included or not, which is the Terrorism Act that was put in place after 9/11. So we're hoping that the U.S. government will also be creating a COVID-19 type coverage to fill in the gaps.
Yeah, and just so I know for a fact that there's 2 bills in Congress already, one from the state of New York and one from California, surprise, surprise, that those would be the first 2 states to put bills in. But we don't know how long that's going to take. Catherine and I researched, and it took 18 months from 9/11 for them to have an actual bill in place for the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. So we would hope with this it would be quicker, because it's affecting so many more industries as far as the COVID. So we just don't know what that's going to be. But there are 2 bills actually in Congress already, and Canada is also doing the same. They have got a government fund that they're trying to put together with the industries up in Canada.